Hello. I thought I'd come on and do a video on a question I've been asked quite a few times in the past couple of weeks, and that is on world building. And first of all, I just want to talk about what you see at the start of all my videos. I haven't got any editing software on here. All of my videos are really rough. As in, I sit down, I put a lot of effort into writing them. But to be honest with you, until I get better software and things like that, yeah, it's going to be like this. Really rough. Information intense, but all the flashy bits cut out. You know, I'm not really much of a flashy YouTuber, never have been. So, one thing I've been asked a lot is, when I'm doing my worlds, how do I make a cool world? How do I make sure that my players, if I'm playing a role-playing game, or my readers if I'm writing a book, or my game if I'm coding a game, how do I get across how in-depth the world is and get across how living the world is, even when you're not there? And that's one thing that great fiction does. It's a game that you think, it's a piece of fiction and a world that you think if you put it down, it would still be there. It's still going to go on without you. You know, you can do whatever you want with Lord of the Rings, but you know, the world itself has a really in-depth lore and history, for instance. And the same goes for Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, by another name. So this is the video on world building, and it comes in a few stages, and we're going to go through them one by one, and hopefully by the end of that you'll have a much better idea on how to build your world. Want my credentials? I've been published twice as an author. I will be putting links in my next video about writing stories. I'll be doing a video on that all to itself, and on that video we will be putting in our stories and making sure that everything comes up roses for that. 1 second, I just want to check something real quick. Again, we're pretty there we go. Yeah, everything's going well. That's cool. So I just wanted to have a double check that my voice is coming through, because we're doing this for the next hour or so, and then find out that I wasn't talking. So yeah, I'll be putting links to my published work in my next video. So you can go and read my stuff and, you know, see if it's any good, see if there's anything that you fancy in there. And of course, it will be on Patreon as well. I'll be doing new things for Patreon in the next couple of weeks. That you can put a bit of money my way, and you can read all about the new characters and new things that I've been planning and things like that. So, without further ado, let's get on with the world building guide video. So, first of all, again, there's a guide to world building, and it's a guide to creating your world so they have weight, depth, and realism. Those are the three things that every single cool fictional world has. It has weight in its histories and its characters and how history influences those characters. It has depth. Now, if you actually go into there and you start turning over rocks and you start pulling things apart and looking down into the nitty-gritty of the world, it doesn't fall apart like a sack of fucking potatoes. And realism. So, realism does not mean that things have to be non-magical. It does not mean things have to be grounded in reality. You can have a realistic world so long as the rules that you've put in place for that world make sense and are, at one thing, constant. Right? So if I say that magic can turn every child in the world inside out if it touches them, that has to be the case all the way through. That's a really weird rule. But as long as it's the case all the way through, you don't break the immersion of the reader or the gamer or the player in the game. Okay? It keeps that realism. It keeps it succinct. People are willing to believe and to spend their disbelief for a lot of things in fiction. So realism is really easy to do as long as you're consistent and you keep a constant line in there and you never break your own rules. So let's get on with the first part, which is forming a basis. And before we go into that, I'm going to take a nice swig from my warmer 40,000 mug. 1 second. Ah, good old English cup of tea. Gotta love it. So, forming a basis. So what kind of world do you want to make? That's the first thing you've got to think of. You know, you sit down, you actually want to go through a world, you actually want to say you want to create, let's say for our fictional world that we're going to create together, let's say it's a medieval setting, nice and easy, okay? So we want to make a medieval setting, it's got a bit of magic and, you know, it's got noble houses, noble families, it's got dragons, it's got mountains, it's got rivers and deserts and different cultures that are going to go in there later on. But for now, we want to do a medieval setting. That's what we thought of, okay? So that's the thing you've got to think of. What kind of setting do you want to make? And it can be as simple as thinking, I want to do a medieval setting, a cyberpunk setting, a steampunk setting, a whale punk setting, a western setting, whatever. And feel free to combine those as well. I mean, I've got a setting in the works as well. There is a medieval cyberpunk setting. You know, in that it's a medieval setting with knights and with you know, noble houses and kings and queens and kingdoms and empires and armies and serfs and mounted knights. But of course, those mounted knights aren't really riding horses. They're actually in big mech suits. And it's a cyberpunk world with the internet and all sorts. So yeah, it's pretty cool. And I've also got a western/steampunk called Driftwood, where it has magic in it as well. Has that thrown in there? So yeah, you can feel free to experiment with that, and when you come up with what you want, we carry on. So, first thing you're gonna understand about this world that we've now got an amalgamous world. It's like a big piece of dough. We just know whether it's medieval coloured or cyberpunk coloured or steampunk coloured or any sort of combination of those where they're in. First thing we're gonna know is what are the limiting factors. Okay, and when I say limiting factors, things like darkspawn, racial tension, or the Reapers. So if you've ever played Dragon Age, for instance, you know, in Dragon Age Origins, the Darkspawn are the big bad, they're the main threat. They're the main thing that's limiting the potential of the world, they're the main thing that's threatening the world, and they're the main thing that's in the background. That's the very important thing. The limiting factors are not the main villains. If you look at the Dragon Age Origins, the Darkspawn aren't really the main villains. They're just there. They're just really bad things. They're like a force of nature. They're coming to kill you. They're coming to kill you and eat your face. But the main bad guy is Loghain, isn't he? Yeah, he's the main. If you play Dragon Age, he is a guy who nearly brings the kingdom to complete and utter ruin through his own stupid agendas and ambitions. You know, in the face of the Darkspawn. Racial tension, for instance, if everyone's ever played Shadowrun, racial tension runs completely through that entire setting, and every single game you ever play in Shadowrun is completely transfixed on that idea of racial tension. It's not a character, it's not the main villain, but it's always there. It's a limiting factor to people being happy and clappy and jumping around and clapping each other in the air, everyone having a lovely time. The Reapers, if anyone plays Mass Effect, the Reapers are, again, always there. Now this is another thing, the Reapers are actually the main villains in Mass Effect, but in the first game, the very first game, they're not the main villains, they're just there. They're just there, out there. They're the things that are going to come in and limit the potential of the Mass Effect universe, because they're there to destroy everything. They're not there in the first game, obviously. They're not even there in the second game, but their presence is always felt. They are a limiting factor on the setting. So that's what we want now, and that's what I want you to think about. What is your limiting factor? It doesn't have to be anything grand. It can be radiation, like in Fallout. It can be magical radiation, like I have in Driftwood, which you know. It can be magic itself. So magic has appeared, and people are fucking freaking out because now people are like, hey, there's wizards around. Let's learn how to use it for porn. You know, that's what a limiting factor is. So try and think. You can have more than one as well. Try not to have more than two though, because then things will get a bit convoluted and you won't know what to do with your myriad different links and settings and factors. So the last thing we want to talk about on forming a basis is what technology level are we seeing. It's perfectly fine to have a medieval setting, okay, that has guns in it and has the internet in it and has, you know, rail guns and mech armor and things like that. In fact, that's really cool. We've seen medieval settings. The medieval settings come out of our arses at the moment. If you walk into any Waterstones or any bookstore, you're going to see fucking medieval fantasy everywhere. Why? Because of Game of Thrones. Thanks, George R.R. Martin. You've killed the genre. No one can really write that anymore. Because if you do, even if you're, by some miracle, your story gets published, your book gets published in a medieval fantasy setting, you are competing against thousands of other writers. Absolute thousands of other writers. So there's no point. Do something original. That's why we're saying, what technology level are we using, or are we seeing? So in cyberpunk, it's completely fine to have a cyberpunk setting that's brought down a little bit, and isn't so cyberpunky. It's kind of like almost kind of like a mixture between steampunk and cyberpunk, where yeah, the internet's a factor, and people have like high-tech gadgets, but only the really rich hackers and deckers have high-tech gadgets. Everyone else has to make do with fucking pipe guns and things like that. You know, that'd be pretty cool. For instance, if you wanted to go the other way, in a setting that I did called Minerva's Cradle, that was essentially cyberpunk, but what happened if Star Trek was cyberpunk? That's literally what I thought. What happened if Star Trek was cyberpunk? What happened if we brought all that technology and really brought it down, and we took all of the faction politics that goes on in Star Trek, and we kept it like that, and that's how that worked out. So there's loads of different things you can do. But what you've got to think of is, what kind of technology level are we seeing? Once you've taken these 4 things into account, you now have a really solid basis, like a nice flat table with bits of land on it, for which we can now start to build our world. Number 2, mine your cultures. Now this is something specific to me. I love history. I have a degree in ancient history and ancient warfare. I love ancient civilizations. I love talking about them. I love discussing them, and we will be discussing them on the channel moving forward. But what you've got to think about is, what cultures fit your world? Now, I'm not expecting you to have a bachelor's degree in ancient history, okay? What I do expect you to do is just to flick through a few books. If you've seen a piece of Roman armour that you think's fucking cool, then go and research it. Go and have a look at what it is. If it's a lorica segmentum, okay, how is it made? Where do they get the metal from? If you like samurai swords, how are samurai swords made? Where do they get the metal from? What kind of cultures use samurai swords? Okay? And we bring them in to our world. Okay? They give potency, depth, and weight to our cultures and histories within our world. We borrow from the world that we know, and we inject it straight into our setting. Now, this isn't plagiarism, this isn't anything like that. These are real cultures that you're working with, and so you do have to change things around, okay? But what you've got to think about is, what quirks, traits, and heroes have you always found interesting from history? You know, do you like Alexander the Great? Great, well, go and learn about him then. Go find out some stuff about him, and inject that into your story. For instance, Ridley Scott, when he was making Gladiator, the character of Maximus isn't based on one Roman, he's based on several. You know, he loved Roman history. He went and he learned about Julius Caesar, about Cornelius Sulla, about Cato, about the real Marcus Aurelius, and he injected those stories into his movie. And so, even though it's complete fabrication, the movie is a complete fiction. Certain things that happened in the movie did happen in Roman history, but they happened at different times. That's a supreme example of taking things, borrowing them, and putting them into your story. For instance, the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, which is very famous at the moment, that is taken from a Scottish part of Scottish medieval history called the Black Dinner, where a lot of people were invited for a dinner and were killed, essentially. And that's where George R. R. Martin got the license to do that from. It's okay to mine and learn your history, to go in and find things that you actually find interesting and put them into your own world. Now, the one thing we have to avoid is being too close. Borrow and change, don't copy, okay? So, the best thing to do is, if you like Alexander the Great, for instance, take his attitude, take his military victories, take his weapons, take his, his style of leadership, fine. That's cool. What you don't want to do is just have Alexander the Great walking around in Middle Earth. That's not what we want, okay? Don't just take the guy and then just change his name, you know? For instance, have an Alexander the Great style leader, but put him in charge of a Roman legion, or not a Roman legion, but a style of a Roman state. You know, so we have the Empire of Proxia. Let's call it that. The Empire of Proxia. And the Empire of Proxia has legions, and it has columns, and it has aqueducts, and it has one massive city surrounded by a load of satellite cities. and the legions are all part of the state. They're a professional army, and they fight for their generals. They don't fight for the state, they fight for their generals, and the generals pay them. But there's this one really cool general called Bob, who's actually Alexander the Great, who's just so cool and so amazing and so good at being a general that he gets loads of these legions up together. He goes and conquers another empire called the Empire of Our Souls. He goes and conquers the Empire of Our Souls, and then comes back and proclaims himself emperor. That's what Alexander the Great would do. And you've just taken someone from history, you plonked them in your own setting, and there you are. And, you know, people love recognizing things even when they don't recognize them in fiction. Like, for instance, you know, whenever I'm reading a book, if I'm reading a book and I start to recognize things that I know in the real world history, unconsciously I will start to really be drawn into that world. It pulls you in, and it gives your entire world depth. So it means if I take out a shovel in your world and I start digging through the soil, I'm going to find stuff. You know, there's actually going to be stuff there. It's not a movie set. It's an actual world. You've just borrowed the depth of that world from somewhere else, tinged it and made it your own, twisted it to make it your own. Okay? So that's what you should do next, is mind your cultures. You know, what cultures are where. And you don't need specifics at the moment. You just need to know what kind of cultures you want to be developing in your world. Okay? So, here's a good part. This is the Empire of Tamriel, and this is a very good map, I've always thought, of the Elder Scrolls, which is, of course, property of Bethesda. And as you can see, we have Skyrim in the north, we have Morrowind, we have Hammerfell, we have the Cyrodiil Imperial Province, we have the Black Marsh, Elsewhere, Bellenwood, and Somerset Isle. What you can see here is something that's going to come in the very next pieces of... what you're going to see here is what you're going to see in the very next pieces of our guide, which is geography. So you have Hammerfell, which is your desert region. You have Skyrim, which is your snowy region. You have Morrowind, which is your strange volcanic region. Black Marsh, which is your marsh region. Elsewhere, which is sandy and, you know, temperate. And you have Valenwood as well, and Valenwood is obviously a wooded area. And you have the Cyrodiil Imperial Province, which is essentially a normal province, the most normal place. It's not supposed to be, by the way. It just is, unfortunately. And of course you have the Somerset Isle, which is where the dickhead elves live. Okay, so we're going to move on from that, because you're going to see why that is a really good bit in a second. Because what we're going to do now is form regions. So what you want to do now is make your world make sense geographically. So what you want to do is get a piece of paper and start writing down, start drawing your map. Just go mad. Go absolutely mad. And draw a map that you think looks cool. And when you've done that, what I want you to do is now place names of the cultures and the empires that you've already thought up in our previous bit of the guide onto this world. Now, what you need to do to make sure that things make sense, it's fine to have things switch around, by the way. So cold being south and warm being north, that's fine. In one of my worlds, the sun rises in the west. It always really wound me the fuck up that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, just like it does on Earth in so many fucking fictional worlds. One thing you've got to take into account, though, cities live around food, trade, and generally water. So if we're having a desert, let's not put a city in the middle of a fucking desert. It makes no sense. Unless you can have some really, really, really convoluted reason that there is some sort of amazing, magically produced spring in the middle of there. They should be either on the coast, on a river, or on a lake, or generally somewhere where they can get to water, where they can get to food, and they can get to trade. Capitals are normally centered around a key event. So, for instance, as I put there, I'm actually playing through Dragon Age again at the moment, which is why there's so much Dragon Age in this video. But Denerim, which is the capital of Ferelden in that game, the region in which Dragon Age Origins takes place, is the birthplace of Dragon Age Jesus, essentially, Andraste. Okay, so that pulls you in already. The city has a history already, and by the capital city having a history, so does the faction and the kingdom itself. So that's what we want to do, is start populating our world now. We lay down our regions, you know, where are the cold regions? Where are the desert regions? Are there any cold or desert regions, or is it just a temperate world? Where are your kingdoms? Where are your empires? Why are they there? Why are their capitals where they are? Best thing to do, what I do, normally, I build my map from the ground up. So I will draw the land, for instance. So you draw the circumference of the land, essentially. So you know where the oceans are, where the seas are, where the land is, and on the land, then I place down my rivers. So I place down the rivers where I want, vaguely where I want the cities to be, and I place down my lakes around the rivers. So obviously lakes don't just form on their own; they form from rivers or heavy troughs of water that are falling from the sky. And then I place down the mountains in that order. So land, rivers, mountains in that order. And in that way, you can actually have a really good template onto which to now graft your empires and your cities and your kingdoms and things like that. If you want two kingdoms to be at war, put them right next to each other. You know, if you want them to be at war over something, put them right next to each other with a big, huge piece of resources between them. For instance, in one of my worlds, there's a thing called Fayerite, and Fayerite is an incredibly good thing to have because it makes unbreakable blades and almost unbreakable stonework as well. And that is in between two empires who, you guessed it, fight over it like cat and fucking dog. So there you go. That's what we're going to do. We're going to form our regions next. I'm going to take a quick break here so we can have a nice glass of cup of tea. So as you can see here, I don't know what world this is. I just thought it was pretty. So you have quite a temperate place in the middle center of the map over here. So you can see in the center of the map lots of green fields, lots of verdant lands, which is pretty cool. And further north it goes, it gets whiter as the cold comes in, and it gets more rugged as well. So you can see the mountains get a bit more prominent as we go up. To the south as well is incredibly hot, so you've got this vast desert area which looks really cool. And again, most of the cities, as you can see, most of the city names are based around rivers or the coast. There are a few that aren't, and I would hope that they would be either on rivers or there's some sort of magical thing, or they're ruined cities. But yeah, this is a lovely world map, absolutely lovely. And of course you've got the mountains running through, because it's important to put obstacles down in the way of conquest. If the mountains are not on this map, then an army can march from one end to the other unimpeded. There has to be a reason why logistics is a thing. So yeah, there you go. That's a lovely map that I found and I thought was really, really cool. So, one of the last parts of the guide is keep the dates down. Okay, if your world is medieval fantasy, you should have no more than 1500 years of history. The reason for that is, if we're trying to keep our world realistic, one thing that is not realistic is having a world that's 10,000 years old, Game of Thrones. That's not realistic at all, because in 10,000 years your technology would have moved on from being medieval. Your history would have moved on, people would have learnt their lessons and generally adapted and got better and better and better, because as human beings, we're fucking awesome, and that's what we do, we learn. Okay, unless there's some sort of really big plot twist coming, in which the reason why the technology is as it is for 10,000 years in Game of Thrones is because of dragons, or because of this, or because of that. That's fine, but for now it makes absolutely zero fucking sense. And it's actually bad writing, because this should have been explained way before now. You cannot throw in a twist like that right to the end of a series. It'll be jarring and it'll be too big. So 1500 years of history is a plenty of time for you to basically go from you know, small empires, small kingdoms, into having big, massive kingdoms with loads of things there going on as well. So that's essentially what I would do. You know, so I think what we're doing is 1500 years of history in real world terms. It's not the year 1500 as you might think, because think about it, the year 1500 was 1,500 years after Christ. And when Christ was born, the Roman Empire was nearly at its height. Emperor Nero was around at that time. You know, Britain was just being conquered by the Roman Empire, so a lot of things had already happened. So we're going to move it back another 500 years to the start of the Roman Republic. That's when the real world history would start. If we were going to be writing, if the real world was a fantasy setting, that's where it would start. 500 years before the birth of Christ. So right at the start of the Roman Republic is where we would start that, and we would move it on over the next 1500 years. So it would actually end. So it actually, our setting would be the year 1000 AD. That would be our setting, which would be a fucking cool setting actually, because that's, look what you've got in the real world. You've got Charlemagne, you've got the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, you've got tons of shit going on. You got the Western Roman Empire has collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire is on the verge of collapse. It's being torn apart by fucking Huns and everyone else. Okay, but it's still there, it's still strong, and we're just about to have our Crusades. We're just about to have the Battle of fucking Hastings. All these really cool things are happening around in the century, the years 1000 to 1100. That's why we only have 1500 years of history, because we want the really cool shit to be happening in the stories that you're going to tell. Okay? We want cool shit to have happened already, but we want what is happening now to be really cool, and you're going to be telling that story. So essentially, that's the best way I can say it as an example, is that, you know, we would obviously, if we were writing a real world fantasy setting, if our world as it is now was a fantasy setting, it would start with the foundation of Rome, and the present day would be the year 1000 AD, where we're just about to have all those awesome things, all those awesome inter-family personal conflicts or religious conflicts, the Black Death. We're about to have all of that happen in our setting, so that's what we want. Cool. Other settings vary, of course. So post-apocalyptic settings, for instance, remove this role as the world and history is ended / does not matter. Now, I don't mean it doesn't matter as in it doesn't matter why the world is a post-apocalyptic setting, because it does matter. It's a huge thing. But what doesn't matter is what Jimmy was eating for breakfast in Connecticut 20 years ago. Or 100 years ago. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. The world is finished. And so you're literally, what I love about post-apocalyptic settings is how hopeful they can be. You're starting again. You have lots of freedom. You can go away and do your own thing, finally. So yeah, so you can sort of disregard this if you're doing a post-apocalyptic setting. Sci-fi also can bend these rules. Can't break them, but it can bend them. Because due to technology and space-time. So let's say you have wormholes, let's say you have the warp, let's say you have warp drives, let's say you have hyperlanes that you've discovered. That would basically mean that, you know, your setting can be 50,000 years into the future from today and have 50,000 years worth of history. That's fine. You're going to be writing for the rest of your fucking life, so you'd be lucky if you get to write a book or a role-playing game or a tabletop game. But you can have 50,000 years of history if you want. I wouldn't. Because, put it this way, Games Workshop, when they did Warhammer 40,000, they had a team of around 50 to 70 people writing the background to Warhammer 40,000, because they wanted to cover 40,000 years of history, and even they, for the first 30,000 years of that history, just had vague things going on. You know? So, you know, yes, there wasn't in this year this happened, this year this happened, this year this happened. They had vast ages of 5,000 years this happened, and then for the next 5,000 years this happened, and you know, and it made sense. But the bigger your your settings get, the more time they're taking up, and the harder they are to not become unruly. Okay, that's what we have for our dates, and that's why I say for a medieval fantasy world, 1500 years is more than enough. So our conclusion at the end of our video: you want to form a basis for our world. Get down our what was I about to say? Oh yeah, get down our fundamentals. You know, what we want. We want to mine for our cultures. We want to borrow from real world cultures. We want to make sure that it really fleshes out our world and gives us strength and depth. We want to form our own world with logic. So we want our regions to be in the right place. We want our cities to be in the right place. We want our world to actually look like people live in it. We actually want it to be something you can actually hold in your hands and feel the earth running through your fingers. Okay? And then the last thing, we want to keep the dates down. So make sure that when we're writing our history, it makes sense. A follows B, follows C, follows D. all the way through. And again, for medieval fantasy setting, 1500 years is more than enough. And all the settings, you can break them, bend the rules a little bit. So that's it. That's the video. Nice and concise. I hope you got a lot out of it. And yeah, I look forward to hearing your success stories with your writing. If you have any writing to send me, send it on in. I'd love to read it. And of course, we'll be going on Patreon pretty soon with our own stories, and our own world building, our own world guides that you can buy on Patreon pretty soon. So yeah, like and share the video if you want to. Give it a dislike if I was shit. And yeah, our next videos will be on, I think they'll be on Dragon Age, on a DLC that I like, but we'll see. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll speak to you guys soon. You're gonna see a bit of my desktop now because my video editing skills are shit. Yes. All right, see you guys later.